Hi, welcome to the next edition in terms of our supplementary content focused on research papers. Remember that at the moment you have a title for a paper that you need to critique. If you can't find that title in your email, you need to email me as soon as possible so that you can get started on your critique. When we review papers or when we read academic papers, it's easy to get lost in all of the ins and outs and the complexity of an individual paper. You're often left with this idea of, what did I just read? It's easy to lose track of the main point. Well, a great academic paper should take you all the way through, from the start through the end. It should not leave you wondering why in the middle of the methods a particular method is applied. All the way through, the authors should make use of what is referred to as a theoretical framework. Now, I have no idea why this little red dot is going everywhere. Presumably there's some recording associated with these slides. It's got nothing to do with me. Now, the first part of a paper is referred to, of course, as the introduction. Yes, there is an abstract, but we'll come back to that at the end of these sessions. The introduction, and as the name suggests, it's how the paper is introduced. All the concepts that underpin the paper are brought forward and given to readers to understand why the paper was conducted in the first instance. So the introduction is intended to do several things. First, most of the introduction is centered around giving the piece of research some context. And that context includes all of the background information that's necessary to understand, or at least an expert reader in the topic, to understand why the paper was first produced. The authors generally identify a clear knowledge gap. How do they do that? We'll come to that in a minute. Of course, the authors also need to highlight the research question or questions that they were hoping to resolve. And as part of those research questions, ordinarily, quite frequently, the authors will propose a set of hypotheses. They might even make a prediction about what they're going to find. But the key point here is that they put forward a set of testable questions that they're going to answer throughout the paper. So how does the context of an introduction work? Well, this is a wonderful example of what the context component of an introduction should do. Obviously, it's not from a research paper, it's from Fantastic Mr. Fox. But when you read this passage, you get a pretty good sense of what a really good introduction should do. Just take a moment and have a look at this text. That on a hill, above a valley, there was a wood. So there was a hill, and it was above a valley, and inside that hill, or on that hill, there was a wood. And then in the wood, there was a tree, a huge tree. And under the tree, there was a hole, and in the hole were the foxes. What does Dahl do in this section? Well, he writes in a fashion that brings you from a broad base into a very fine point, the foxes, from that more distant perspective of a hill. There are lots of things that could be happening on the hill, but we're interested in the final point here on Mr. Fox. How does this help us in terms of understanding papers? Well, that is exactly how an introduction to a paper should be written. In fact, every section in an academic paper uses what we see here, the writing funnel, in which at the start a broad statement or around the context is first given, and then progressively through a literature review of what's known and perhaps what isn't, and where the gaps are within that literature, slowly refining to the point that you identify a problem or a general question, and then come down to specific hypotheses and perhaps identify a way in which you're going to tackle that problem. the writing funnel from broad down to narrow. And if you think of academic writing as boring, maybe you're right, but just because we're writing about factual things doesn't mean that we can't be imaginative and engaging in our writing. Take this paper, for example. This is one of my favourite papers, because I'm pretty into tree rings and also the use of stable isotopes in tree rings. But it's also one of my favourite papers because of the manner in which it starts. See the first sentence in the introduction. Trees are wonderful things. Of course they are. They are fantastic things. But what the authors need to do, having made that really broad statement, is to then make a clear argument as to why they're wonderful things. What is it about them that's so wonderful? And well, they do that in the subsequent sentences. Not only do they do that, they illustrate, as they move through, a narrowing field of view that brings us down to the point that we end the first paragraph having started with the idea that trees are wonderful things, but we end here with the concept that we can use the tree rings they form to study all sorts of things thousands of years into the past, which is a pretty wonderful thing. The subsequent paragraphs slowly bring the reader in to the point where we're asking questions about the use of stable isotopes in tree rings. Now that is one clear pathway that brings us down to a set of aims that they have for this paper, some questions that they then address. But the idea here is that in the introduction, the authors have given us the context. They outline what the problem is, the desire to understand how we can use stable isotopes in tree rings. They do that, and then they bring us down to the point where they identify, at least in this paper, because it's a literature review, they identify that to improve knowledge, they're going to provide the overall literature review, and then what the aims of this piece of work was. So they start broad and come in. But this is the typical format for an introduction. The broad context, working through the available literature to identify a problem, and then a possible solution to that. And that solution is how this paper is going to be conducted. Now, the ideas that are put forward are based upon what we refer to as the theoretical framework. What's a theoretical framework? Well, there's a really great paper available for you online, and I'd really encourage you as a student, perhaps a first year student with plenty of writing in front of you, to have a look at this paper. If not for this course, then to support your successful outcomes, I'm sure they will be successful outcomes in subsequent assessments in which you are asked to write a paper. The theoretical framework provides a basis for understanding the problem or the question that is addressed in an individual paper, and it should logically move the reader from that broad statement at the start to an endpoint in which hypotheses are discussed, for example. Establishing a logical structure, a logical argument, a theoretical framework is a key part of ensuring, one, that your paper stays on topic. But more importantly, it's a critical pathway to clearly communicating with your readers. And if you can't do that, there's no point writing in the first place. And it's also a very useful strategy for assessment because it's the kind of thread, the kind of logical structure that academics look for when they're marking student assessment, as well as the content-related stuff. Now, one of the key elements of a theoretical framework within an introduction is the use of literature to support the argument that is built in that introduction itself. And that literature provides an evidence-based foundation upon which, the basic concepts, the key limitations, the gaps that exist are entirely based. So reviewing literature, and a short literature review, maybe a long one, is a key component of establishing a logical theoretical framework. Without it, an introduction is really just a set of opinions. And academic papers need more than that. They need to incrementally build on existing knowledge. To do that, we need to refer to that existing knowledge within a literature review. Now, of course, it's not just a list of papers. It's not, and this is a pretty classical approach to literature reviews in a lot of work that I've marked. That the writer simply writes that this person said that person said this, all the way through. It's just a shopping list, basically. Literature reviews are not that. Literature reviews need to draw out, common threads from the literature, or use the literature to build an argument. Not just say, oh, these people all said this, and then leave it at that. No, you need to make use of that literature to identify what is known, as well as where there is a gap into which the paper you're writing or you're reviewing inserts itself. Now, without that literature review, again, there is no basis for proceeding. What do you do in a field in which there's very little literature? Well, you do what you can. So the literature review is a key part, but it needs to be more than just a list. After that review, we should be left with a set of possible research questions, or a gap. The gap becomes the basis, the space into which you can generate a research question. Now, research questions obviously need to be something that we can actually test, but what they do, they provide the focus for the rest of the paper. Whenever you're writing, you need to remember, what is the research question in this paper? And if I'm writing about a method that in no way delivers on that research question, then I either need to change my research question or I need to eliminate that content. So it focuses the writing, also helps focus the reader. And it keeps papers clear and precise. Having a research question gives the writing something to target. And it is always targeted on that in a very linear and clear fashion. Now, what constitutes research questions? Well, there are a couple of different approaches to them, and two acronyms are used to describe the kind of questions that researchers generate: PICO and SPICE. And you can see the way that the acronyms here are populated. The PICO research question compares two different interventions, for example. The SPICE approach simply evaluates an intervention on its own. Let's see how that works. Here's an example that a great ape researcher that used to work in this course put together for us. So if you're wondering about the content, it comes from them. So here is a study in which great apes with stereotypic behaviour do high inositol diets compared with normal diets result in reduced self-harm. So what's going on in here? Well, here you can see that we are making a direct comparison. So this is a PICO style question where the population is defined as great apes with particular behaviour. There's an intervention and we are comparing to the normal diet. And there's an outcome. How does that compare to a SPICE example? Well, here's the same example but with a different twist. So do high inositol diets, as opposed to normal diets, reduce stereotypic behaviour in captive great apes? So here we're not interested in that self-harm comparison. We are interested in having an impact on an existing behaviour, bringing it down. So we are looking to intervene. So the setting is in captivity. We have great apes. We have high inositol diets. We're making a comparison or a control, but this is not being compared to, we're not making comparison between things, We're intervening relative to that baseline. So we don't have two that we're weighing up. We've got a starting point and then we're intervening. Now, do you really need to know this for your review or your critique? No, but it's worth knowing when you put together or think about research questions, how am I meeting these basic requirements for an intervention or a comparison study? Now, research questions naturally lead to hypotheses, and hypotheses are the very things that we test when we collect data and we analyse them. Often, hypotheses include a prediction of what we expect is going to happen. Let's say, for example, if we are running an intervention or an experiment. And that means that we often state them as explicitly as an if, then, because statement. That if I take this action, then it will have this outcome because it does this. Now, they don't always have to be written in that form, but more often than not, we see a in the presence of, or if this is done, then that will happen. The because part is often argued early on in the introduction within the framework. It must be there somewhere because you need to be able to support the if, then with a because. The theoretical framework gives you the because, and if that because is not in there, your paper is missing something big. Now, there can be multiple hypotheses corresponding with a single research question, because research questions themselves are not necessarily something that we can test quantitatively, but hypotheses are. Obviously, they need to be testable and clearly stated. And they also need to be falsifiable. So we need to be able to go out and collect data and then test using our typical statistical techniques. Well, now is a good time to take out your paper. If you haven't read it already, it's not the end of the world, but it's a good time to at least access it online, download it, and maybe have a look at the introduction. You know, what does your paper do insofar as offering an introduction with a clear theoretical framework? Does it give you, the reader, an adequate introduction to the research question or problem by giving you that background, by highlighting the existing literature? So does it review peer-reviewed literature to give you a basis of understanding what's out there in the field and what's known and what's different about this paper? What is the space? Where is the gap that this one's trying to fill? So also, as they're doing that, do they use referencing? And we'll talk about referencing in the next session. Do they include referencing in their arguments? If not, why not? Well, is there no research on this? And do they offer evidence to support the assertions that they make around there being a gap? They can't just say, well, there's a gap here, and then offer no evidence for that. Also, are there genuinely testable research questions or a research question in there? And maybe, are there hypotheses in there too that they clearly outline? Right, that's it for this one. Next time, I'll cover referencing.